If you are passionate about miniature painting, then you may have what I call a unicorn in your collection. By unicorn, I mean a model that you put on a pedestal above all others, so much so that you feel unworthy to actually paint it. For me, that model was the Exorcist tank. 2 years ago, when I was deciding what faction to play when returning to 40k, I remember looking through all the models on the Games Workshop website and instantly losing my mind at this cathedral pipe organ missile launcher tank. It looks so grandiose and over the top. I can only imagine the horror it would strike into the souls of the heretics, hearing the organ music in the distance and watching as long-range missiles fire from the pipes. So it was actually the first model that I actually bought for the Adepta Sororitas, and I never painted it, until now. In this video I hope to share some tips and tricks for painting this and other tanks to a high standard, even if, like me, you find the model a little intimidating. Before I continue, this will not be the only video I do on painting the Exorcist tanks. I've actually acquired 2 more of these over the years, and I plan to paint them in different themes. I also have 2 older model Exorcists with metal parts, which I got for a great price on eBay. They've had a rough life, they're dirty with pieces missing, but I hope to bring new life to them. So, what theme am I starting with? Well, since the box art is what made me fall in love with the tank and the army to start with, I decided to go with an armored lady theme. This style really resonates with me and I've been wanting to do it for a very long time. I'm not going to customize this one too much, I'm just going to stick mostly to the theme but try and improve it in a few ways. On my next tank I plan to do a Bloody Rose theme. Bloody Rose is the order I tend to play the most, and I tend to be a bit more creative in how I build out the miniatures. Okay, so let's get started. For such a complex model, the build process was surprisingly painless. I did glue the top of the tank before painting, but I left it open here to show you where I have glued a 3x6mm magnet inside the tank. This will allow me to add and remove the hunter-killer missile as needed. This is the only magnetization I opted for. I've seen some people magnetize the launchers on top of the model, but I didn't see a lot of point in doing this as the launchers do sit fairly comfortably in their place, and unless you're shaking the model around they probably won't fall out. This is the sub-assemblies I chose and I feel they work quite well. If you don't separate it out in these exact parts, it'll still be very paintable. However, there will be little bits that are quite difficult to paint, especially the driver and some of the organ pipes. One issue I found was the sprues on 2 Exorcists I bought 2 years ago had a defect on the smoke blowers. I believe this must have only affected a limited run of these tanks, as the sprue in the newer kit did not have the same problem. So I substituted the damaged parts for now, and on a later project I may have to 3D print some or improvise. Once fully built, I started to base coat the miniature. Due to the climate where I live, I'm using a airbrush, however rattle can or hand priming will also suffice. I'm only using an airbrush for the base coat. All of the texturing on the tank will be done later via dry brushing. I spent a lot of time considering how exactly I was going to add texture to the large areas of the tank, and while the airbrush gradients do look good, dry brushing looks so much more natural and I really like the end result, which you'll be able to see soon. For this base coat I'm using a Vallejo black surface primer with a few drops of paint thinner. You will notice that I'm going to be wearing a glove on the hand that is touching the model in most of this video. I generally only wear gloves when working on models like tanks where you have no choice but to frequently touch the model. Many other miniatures can be held by the base or having far less contact points. Wearing gloves will avoid oils from your skin affecting the model. After the base coating, I'm starting with a second base coat on the tracks. This time I'm using Iron Warriors. I'm not too concerned with this part as it's going to be under the model. I just wanted to get it out of the way. My plan for painting the model is to start with the hardest to reach spots and work out from there. So that meant starting with the marble floor in the tank. I plan to use a mix of contrast paints, so that means starting with a coat of white. While I'm at it, I may as well do the painful process of painting the organ keys. Don't stress too much with this step, just try to keep it as neat as possible and alternate between black and white to clean up any areas where you go too far. I'm also going to use this time to paint the second layer of the organ keys, which I had left out as a separate sub-assembly. To introduce a little bit of ivory colour into the keys, I'm adding a layer of skeleton horde contrast paint. Then I'm going over with a light brushing of white again to bring out some of the highlights. This also gives the keyboard more of a grungy, used look. Once this is done, the keyboard can be glued back into the model. Good news for Inquisitor Electro, I'm going to be talking about the marble floor. To be honest, I didn't have a firm plan and the results are more of a lucky experiment than a masterful idea. I just knew I wanted a rough mix of purple and blue. I started with equal parts mix of achromatic blue, contrast paint, and Targor Raid Shade. This may sound like a weird mix, however Raid Shade is a very light shade paint with a purple hue. So I thought it would take some of the edge off of the achromatic blue. This sort of worked out, but the purple felt a little bit too weak. So while it was still wet, I lightly blended in some Magus Purple contrast paint, and that worked a lot better. If you don't have a shade paint, then any sort of contrast medium will help reduce the contrast paint, but I think this worked really well in the end. I contemplated painting some marble veins, but didn't want to ruin the simplicity of it. So perhaps I'll be more adventurous on the next Exorcist. While that was drying, I decided to work on some of the other parts. My plan for this chair was to cover the seat back with Screaming Skull or any warm white colour, then dry brush that same colour over the wood parts. I should point out now that I know a few of these scenes will be out of focus and I apologise. I'm working on a fix for this in future videos and have come up with a better way to mount the camera. So anyways, the chair back is covered in a coat of Volupus Pink and the wood area is covered in Wildwood. Then I dry brush the seat with some Screamer Pink layer paint and dry brush the wood, very light edge highlight of Screaming Skull, just to pick out the edge highlights of the wood. Very simple recipe, but it looks great. Continuing on inside of the model, I'm painting all of the pipes with Screaming Bell. Before you ask, yes, most of the paints so far have had something about screaming in the name. The imagination of the Citadel team must be running a little dry. I like this colour as it is a bit warmer than Retributor armour. It still feels gold, but it leans closer to a brass colour. Once highlighted with a dry brush of silver layer paint, I think it looks pretty close to an actual organ pipe. I'm mostly going to use contrast paints for the roses and the floor runner, so I gave them a base coat of white. Then I used Volupus Pink again on the floor runner and some Retributor armour on the middle bar. I want the organ pipes to stand out from the other gold, so all of the other gold will be done in Retributor armour. Here we have the roses painted and the floor runner touched up with some Screamer Pink. Don't waste too much time on this as the shrine that is yet to be inserted will cover up most of this space. Not much to say about the shrine. My formula for this model is mostly as follows. For silver metals, I start with Iron Warriors, dry brush of bright silver, very straightforward. And if needed, use some null oil for a shade. For wood, I roughly paint wood grain with Screaming Skull, like on the seat back, coat with Wildwood contrast paint, then highlight again with a light dry brush of Screaming Skull if required. For statues, I'm painting white, coating with Skeleton Horde, then dry brushing Screaming Skull to bring out some of the stronger highlights. It's all very simple layering, there's not that much skill involved, it's more just knowledge about what each of these layers is adding to the model, and then getting that experience of how much to load up your brush, how much to take off of your brush, and how to use your brush. Once you get experience of doing all of these things, it'll be very easy and very natural. Before I glue the pipes in, you'll see that I've painted all of the wood. It looks great, but no one will ever see it because the pipes will be in the way. So I'm going to dry brush all of the pipes with silver to act as a highlight. The silver I'm using is Vallejo Game Air Silver. It is by far my favourite silver paint. However, if you want to use a Citadel paint, then Ironbreaker is probably the next best thing. With the internals painted, it's safe to glue in some more parts. I'm leaving the driver out for now until I dry brush the wood trim around the top, as I don't want to accidentally paint the driver. Speaking of the driver, I'm going to start by dry brushing 3 layers, going lighter and drier with each layer. The layers I've chosen are Dark Reaper first, then Thunderhawk Blue, then Fenris and Grey, although similar colours will work just as well. When I do my Bloody Rose theme, it's normally the same. I will likely base coat with Evil Suns, dry brush Wild Rider, and very light dry brush of Fire Dragon Bright. Again, just substitute for similar colours as needed. You don't need to buy Citadel paints if you've got something similar already. Dry brushing is a fantastic technique to experiment with, especially for metals. If you want to get a nice brush metal look, it also lets the model do most of the heavy lifting for you. You're not so stressed about painting with super precise lines. The challenge is more about making sure you have the right amount of paint on the brush and that you're swiping the model from the right angles. Next I'm going to use those red colours from earlier to paint the robes. The rest is just painting in the metallics, the shoulder emblems, and the driver is ready for an exorcism. Moving on to the tank body, I'm going to use those same 3 colours I used for the driver's armour. First colour I am applying in a stippling action. This is similar to dry brushing, but instead of swiping across the model, you are jabbing paint onto the model. Try to lightly stipple at the bottom and apply heavier towards the top. This may look a little weird at first, but it will come together soon. The stippling fills in a lot of the large areas of space. However, without edge highlights, it will be a little hard to determine the overall feel. For the next layer, I'm going to switch from a stippling action to more of a dry brushing action, to catch as many of the edges as possible. This isn't meant to overpower the stippling. When you wipe the paint off on a paper towel, it is important to remove quite a lot of it. Otherwise it'll probably look a lot stronger or create streaking. This is starting to look a lot better. The tank is still technically black, but blue makes it look a little more worn and like it is reflecting some of the surroundings. For the final layer, I'm going to dry brush even lighter and focus mostly on downstrokes at all of the edges. I only want this to pick up on the very edge and give it a little bit of sharpness. If you've ever tried painting in edge highlights before by hand, by loading up your brush and just doing a line, you know it is a lot of work to get right, and here we've let the model do most of the work for us. The beauty is already there, we're just trying to tease it out. While I'm dry brushing, I also did the top railing of Screaming Skull so that I can paint it with wildwood. Where possible, I'm making sure that the streaks go with the wood grain so it looks a bit more authentic and natural. All we were doing here is imagining the look of the materials like wood or brushed metal and working out the best way to layer paints, painting techniques and effects to get that result. Next steps are mostly using the techniques I've already talked about to fill in the additional detail. For the areas I've blocked out in red, I'm stippling lighter colours where I can, just so that there is a bit of difference and interest in the model. You don't want to have large areas of the exact same colour. There aren't many edges in the red, but it's still important to dry brush those wherever you see them. There isn't really anything else to learn from me painting this wildwood. I just find it super satisfying. If you haven't tried contrast paints, do it. They're so much fun. With the trim painted, the driver seat back and driver can now be added. You don't have to glue the driver in, but I decided to. I don't have any reason to remove her again. Let's talk about some of the remaining components. The missile launchers are painted the same as the organ pipes. For the exhaust braziers, these are the paints that I used. Base coat of Iron Warriors, armor shade gloss is used on the shielding that has all the holes in it. Game Air Silver is used for a dry brush highlight. mostly using down strokes. The flame itself is base coated white, then coated with Iandan yellow, grabbing a small amount of Bale red from my brush and applying it at the top and wet blending down into the yellow. Then I'm finishing it all up with a coat of null oil over all of the metal. There wasn't much else to show you in this process, but I finished it all now and I'm back in the booth to give it a coat of satin varnish. Before I did this, I did however use a brush on varnish just over the panel where the magnet is underneath. This will add some extra thickness and protection, since the magnet is likely to rub on this area. Okay, now let's take a look at the finished product. I really enjoyed tackling this unicorn and bringing it to life. The big question though, was it really worth waiting 2 years to start on it? Or could I have painted it a lot sooner and still had a satisfactory result? Well, luckily I did paint a tank 2 years ago in a Martyred lady theme, so I can compare them both side by side. I wouldn't say this immolator is drastically worse, and both would still be able to sit side by side on the tabletop without looking too unusual. However, I can definitely see a difference in quality. For one, this was before I had an airbrush. It was a 30 degrees Celsius day, so the black rattle can primer I used dried partly before I reached the model, which gave it a really rough coating. This kind of doomed the painting process from the start, so even the varnish on the model still looks a bit strange, almost wet, because it's on a very rough surface. A few of the colour choices are a bit questionable. The silver feels way too bright for me. There's not a lot of layering technique. There's not really any dry brushing at all. There isn't the same sense of texturing and value that makes the model feel cohesive. However, again, both models look reasonable side by side on the table. If I had built my Exorcist then instead of the immolator, I would have still been proud of it, and I would have still learnt a lot. I'm only able to paint the Exorcist better now because I went through that experimental stage and learnt a lot from painting models badly, so that I can paint them sort of good. Good is very subjective, but I think it looks a lot better. I guess the takeaway is, it's good to have unicorns, but don't wait forever to paint it. Every model you paint will help you gain more and more experience, and if you really hate it later on, there's no harm in stripping it back and painting it again. It doesn't matter how many of these videos you watch, you will learn from them, sure, but until you put brush to model and just go with it, you will never really improve or know how much you're capable of. Don't let your unicorns get the best of you. So, do you have a unicorn model? If so, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. And when you get to painting it, I'd love you to post it on my Discord, which is linked in the description. So thank you for watching. I hope you got a little bit of inspiration from this video and perhaps learned something new. See you next time.